Good day to you, and a final good day to you for this semester and for comparative media. You know, as we look back across this course, we realize, I hope, that the world is a pretty big place. And when all is said and done, by the time you vacate this world, you probably will have only danced in just a few of the 200 countries that are out there and have been exposed to just a few of the cultures that exist across the world, including the media systems that exist within these cultures. We know that these media systems are influenced by globalization, and that process continues to unfold across the world as media, along with other factors, bring the world closer together. We also know that there are several elements that are parts of media systems. We know that those elements include the cultural characteristics of a country. We know they include the philosophy that tends to have taken root in a country. We know that these elements also include the regulations that a government puts into action in a country. We know that these elements also include how media are financed. We know that these elements also include the content that results that results in part because of these elements that I just previously mentioned, as well as the news reporting, as well as the imports and exports that a country is involved in. And finally, all of this comes to play in how audiences interact with media. And those interactions help make up the kind of person that you are. The kind of person you are growing up, not just as an American, but as a person who is exposed to an American media system and perhaps other media systems if you have that chance to travel. When looking back across the 8 countries that we studied, we know that each one of them has very unique attributes for its particular media system. We know that in France, one of the most interesting and unique things about the French media is that the government is both a player in media competition and is also a regulator or a referee of a media system. We know that French media are very free when it comes to content involving sexuality. We know that French media are also very often focused on culture and communicating the idea of what it means to be a French person in French culture. Moving on to Sweden, we know that Sweden has some of those attributes that are similar to France, particularly when it comes to nudity and sexuality. But we know that Swedish media also are very good at teaching their own population other languages, notably English. We know that Swedish media also are very direct media and will publish content that is sometimes considered to be, of questionable appropriateness to others because of its vividness. The C section as a photograph that was published in a newspaper is a good example of that. Moving on to Britain, we know that British media are very literary oriented because people are big readers. We know that the government regulator Ofcom in Britain is the biggest regulator out of all the countries that we've studied. We know that British media is heavy on documentaries. And we know that the BBC has public service standards, but so do the commercial media in Britain. Moving on to the United States, we know that the United States is the biggest media exporter. We know that the United States is the most capitalistic country of all, especially when it comes to media, and that media are predominantly funded by advertising, resulting in a very weak public media sector in the United States. We know that when we move on to Mexico, that Mexico is a country that's still trying to recover from 71 years of autocratic dictatorial rule. And so there are freedoms that journalists enjoy, but there are freedoms that are curtailed at the same time. The book didn't get into this that much because these factors were not as big at the time when I wrote the book, but the drug cartels are as much of a threat to media as the government was under dictatorial leadership. We know also that the government is heavily involved in the financing of media because they purchase the advertisements. And so in a way, there is still control because the media are reluctant to cover government in a critical way for fear of losing those advertising accounts. We know also that a lot of American media permeate into the Mexican media, in part because we share a border with Mexico. Moving to China, we know that China is a communist country. And so control over the media is absolute by the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. And that means a lot of Western content is prevented from coming into China. But at the same time, we know China has experimented with some free market mechanisms. And so there are dimensions of the media that have private profit making, including advertising. And that also there are dimensions of Chinese media which are critical. Chinese media content is critical of municipal government. and not necessarily of the Communist Party at a national level, but at smaller levels of government. We know that when we talk about Ghana, that Ghana is a country like Mexico, still recovering from a history of dictatorial leadership. And we know that that country is also a country that is struggling to cope with the idea that it has a level of poverty that most people suffer from. But also there are traditions in Ghana that make it hard for certain media to take root, certain oral traditions that come with languages that are only spoken. They are not written. And so developing newspapers is going to be very challenging, as it is to develop other media, because the infrastructure is not there, with electricity being extended to all of the country. We know that the Ghanaian government is reluctant to regulate media because there's a suspicion of the strength of government. They never want to return to those days where they have a strong-armed government enforcing what it wants to be broadcast in media. And similarly, and finally, we know that when we get to Lebanon, we have a country that is so small, and a country that has been through so much civil war and really so many centuries of occupation. It's a country that is largely fractious, and that various religions are behind this fractioned country of Lebanon. We know that Lebanon struggles to regain its footing from its civil war days, and that it still today is under the threat from countries around it in such a way that it actually has laws that govern not criticizing foreign leaders, because it can be easily overrun as a country. So those unique attributes now bring us to summing up the major themes in this course that we find in terms of differences in content across media systems. And we know that there are three areas that we have hopefully gained a more global understanding of. And one of those is the public service dimension of media versus the private profit-making dimension of media. We know that when you have private profit-making media that are getting money from advertising, that the goal is not necessarily to educate, to inform, or to enlighten, that it is simply to amass an audience that is going to be a profitable audience for selling ad time to. So this then means that the second dimension that I want to talk about comes into play, and that is whether you end up with media that is a product or a service. When you're providing a product, it really doesn't matter whether you're helping people. You're providing something that is purchasable, and it is identified by a brand, NBC, CBS, or ABC, for example. Versus when you have public media, the goal is not necessarily to make money, but to make sure that your electorate is informed and to also uplift people, to keep them moving in directions that improve their lives. Now let's go into another dimension of media, and that is the dimension of nudity, profanity, and sexuality. We know that that dimension has very much to do with the differences between Europe and the United States, and in some cases Ghana and China and Mexico. But in essence, we can say that the European countries have a flipped version of what is appropriate in their content versus these other countries. The European media see sexuality, profanity, and nudity as part and parcel of real life, and therefore the media content that carries it is simply representing real life. And it doesn't need to be censored as long as penetration is not being shown. As long as these three areas of nudity, profanity, and sexuality are within a context that is realistic, being portrayed in a drama or in a news report, that's okay. The United States has an opposite viewpoint because of a Puritan upbringing and also because of a question of appropriateness of obscene content being exposed, being delivered to children. When you look at violence, though, we have the opposite in place. We know that in European countries, that the violence that is associated with what goes on in those countries is not going to be portrayed in terms of drama, in terms of very explicit violence with blood gushing and sounds of bones being crunched. We know that violence will be shown in news reports because it is where it is realistically happening in life and therefore is appropriate to news reports. But other violence, gratuitous violence, is screened out by regulation. In the United States, we have the opposite. We see violence as just an appropriate form of entertainment, and so it fits in with dramas. But when we talk about our news programs, we don't believe that violence has a place because it's inappropriate for the dinner table. And so this then will wrap up the course Comparative Media. I hope that you've been given tools that will allow you to look at any country. It doesn't necessarily need to be the 8 countries that we've studied in this class, but any country, that will help you understand how your media system that you're being exposed to shapes you as a person. And with that, I wish you well for the holiday season. Thank you for taking my class.